Hello, and welcome to this joint webinar, which has been prepared for you by Ground Control, Cobham, Inmarsat and Atos. I'm Liz Wilson, I'm a director at Ground Control, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to the rest of today's speakers. So first of all, you're going to hear from Damian Lewis from Inmarsat. He's going to take us through some key elements from their recent industrial IoT report as they relate to the utilities and renewables sectors. Then Christian Straurup from Cobham will make the case that unpredictability is the new normal and the considerations that utilities companies should make as they seek to adapt. You'll then hear from me again. I'll take us through 3 case studies from utility companies who've tackled some of the challenges identified by Inmarsat and Cobham head on. And finally, Nigel Garner from Atos will speak about the PSTN switch off. This specifically impacts British companies, but the recommendations Nigel makes equally apply to connectivity challenges created by climate change, aging infrastructure and cybersecurity. There is the option to ask questions. You should see a little Q&A button on your screen. We are quite tight on time, so if we can't answer them during the presentation, I'll look at them after the event, circulate, and then when we send the recording of the presentation around, I'll make sure the answers to those questions are included. So I'm now going to hand over to Damian to discuss Inmarsat's recent research into industrial IoT.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. As Liz said, my name is Damian Lewis, and I'm the Market Development Manager for Inmarsat's Enterprise Business Unit, focused on energy and utilities. And I'm going to focus today on the findings from a research study that we conducted last year into industrial IoT across a number of sectors. But the focus today is, of course, on electrical utilities. So we kicked off the project at the start of 2021, and what we were trying to understand was how has IoT adoption changed since we last surveyed our target industries in 2018, and what impact, if any, had COVID-19 had on this. We surveyed 450 IoT decision makers with an even split across agriculture, electrical utilities, mining, oil and gas, and transport and logistics. And all of the organizations were fairly large. They all had over 250 employees. And as you can see on the slide, from utilities, most were much larger than that, with over 60% of the companies having over 1,000 employees. We also aimed to provide a fairly even geographic split between Americas, EMEA, and Asia Pacific, though for utilities, as you can see, nearly half the respondents were from the Americas, and then the remainder were fairly evenly split across EMEA and Asia Pacific. Now, as we're working with limited time, I'm going to focus on just some of the key findings on the next slide there. From the research, just summarizing some of the key bits that stood out. So firstly, increased investment seems to be supporting rapid acceleration in IoT projects across the sector, with companies set to spend an average of $3 million on IoT in the next 3 years, which represents the highest proportion of their overall IT budget at about 10%. That was a change from 2018. It overtook cloud technology. This spending also seems to be justified by proven and forecasted return on investment that companies are seeing, with 10% cost savings in the first year anticipated to rise to 30% by the end of a 5-year period. But there were challenges that were uncovered in the research. Companies talked a lot about security challenges and associated skill gaps in the industry for integrating technology in a secure way, as well as how data is managed once it's collected and potential weaknesses in connectivity. To quote our friends at Cobham, in fact, without wanting to preempt Christian's presentation, bad things are going to happen. And I think customers across the industry are aware of this and aware of the importance in overcoming these challenges if they're going to maintain a stable supply of service and get best value from their IoT projects. But because of time, I'm going to focus just on one theme, a theme close to our hearts, but also one that has to be amongst the most important of challenges that needs to be resolved for IoT programs to be effectively deployed. And that's connectivity, because IoT is effectively a network of networks, and yet 75% of organizations that we spoke to said they encountered connectivity problems in the trial or proof of concept phase of IoT projects. And then 62% said they continued to wrestle with connectivity challenges even after full deployment of a project. And this causes disruption and impacts operational efficiency. On the bright side, they said that once these challenges were overcome, once connectivity challenges were solved, 80% of organizations claim to be enjoying successful IoT deployments. And that starts to paint a bit of a picture of how important getting the connectivity element right just is. If you've got a lot of problems deploying successfully when the connectivity isn't quite working, but then success and happiness once you get it right, it must be an important thing. So then when we started to look at the types of connectivity available, we see some interesting results again, especially when we benchmark against other industries that we included in the study. So despite the connectivity issues that I just mentioned, and despite 59% of electrical utility companies stating that public terrestrial services such as fibre and cellular either weren't quite good enough or just weren't good enough at all for their needs, actually only 32% said that they were using satellite connectivity. Now the average across the other sectors was 47%, so that's quite a gap, 32, 47. And that suggests that across the electrical utility sector at least, there's some work to be done there for satellite operators and our partners in ensuring that those companies know what we can do to help solve their problems that they're saying that they are experiencing and that can't be solved by terrestrial services. And again, when we looked at the attributes that respondents wanted in their connectivity services, this is interesting, again, a bit of a surprising clash. So reliability, security, and network coverage scored highest as the attributes that respondents wanted. And yet there is this continued dependence on cellular and Wi-Fi networks, with only 37% of respondents saying that they switched to backup connectivity when they're unable to connect to their preferred connection type. So it's quite surprising. You've got an industry that says, we're investing in IoT, we want to deploy more and more IoT, we see huge cost benefits of doing that, but things don't work very well if we don't get the connectivity right. Once we do get connectivity right, things go a lot more smoothly. Then there's an acknowledgement that terrestrial networks obviously have a huge part to play, but they're not going to solve all of our problems, and that proves a real challenge. And yet there's a lower than average adoption of satellite connectivity and a low use of backup connectivity in general. So this tells us that there's a great opportunity for us to work with, educate and learn from those companies to make sure that we're providing reliable, secure and robust services. Now that's all I'm going to have time to say on the actual research, but before I finish, I should just flag up what Inmarsat's doing to respond. And as always, we're collaborating with our partners. We're collaborating with our partners to continue to deliver unrivaled services over our Alera network, which continues to deliver unmatched network availability at 99.95%, end-to-end wholly redundant security in place, and a world-class cybersecurity office to ensure a service that can be relied upon, not just as available, but also as secure. That is relied upon by businesses and governments worldwide. And you can see there on the slide, we've launched our record-breaking I6 satellite, which brings increased bandwidth, speed, and flexibility to help our customers unlock, accelerate, and scale their projects effectively and securely. And that's going to be a very exciting thing. That's moving into its position at the moment. So we'll be delivering services for that very, very soon. It's an exciting step forward. And with that, I'm going to leave you and hand over to Christian to discuss the key points from Copham's white paper. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Damian. My name is Christian, and I'm a marketing director in Copham Satcom. And we have done some research into what the utility sectors can do in order to overcome these connectivity issues they are facing. And we have written a very comprehensive paper with the title, "The Unpredictability is the New Normal," and I will come back to that. So regardless of if we believe that climate change are caused by humans or not, the facts are pretty clear. The climate changes are causing many more outages and much more severe outages all over the world. This summer, parts of Germany were flooded and E.ON had to cut off power to more than 165,000 customers alone. In many states in the US, the average number of minutes for power outage has increased dramatically. The unpleasant truth is clear. The number of outages and the length of these outages are increasing. So in 2013, the Climate Central found that the number of outages has increased tenfold in a period of only 28 years, and that more than 80% of all the outages are caused by weather conditions. Eaton in Australia found the devastating truth for companies. That means that for many corporations, 33% of the corporations, it took more than a day to recover. And for 10% of these corporations, it took more than a week. Now, just for a moment, speculate about the direct cost for these corporations. And if we expand our view, the cost of these outages skyrockets. When, for instance, the flooding in Germany took place, one of the first things that suffered was public safety. So when bad things are happening, and they will, the populations are left in the dark without the ability to call for help. The emergency services is often impacted by lack of open communication lines. And not to mention the cost of reputational risk, which in many cases exceeds the direct costs. So the questions to ask is not if bad things will happen, neither if bad things will cost a fortune. The right thing to ask is, how do you prepare your organization to respond to these bad things? It seems like a Gordic knot. The utility companies are asked to raise the service level without increasing the prices. This demand comes with political overhead. And as you see in this quote, this is from the UK Energy and Climate Change Minister. However, as we saw in the Inmarsat research, there is a tremendous amount of cost savings lying ahead, but connectivity issues prevent utility companies from tapping into this well of cost savings. And that is why we at Cobham Satcom looked into how we, with our technology, can help the utility sector become more resilient power grid. And for your benefit, we have a paper that you can download at the end of the presentation. It is not an easy task to solve this Gordic knot. And for many utility companies, the communication setup may not be part of the core business and may not be some of the internal capabilities that you focus on. You need the right information at the right time in the right format to make sound decisions. But does your current communication infrastructure provide you with the right capabilities? And what about the costs? Inmarsat found in their paper that in 2013, utility companies are expected to save 157 billion in costs alone from smart meters. But will this cost be diminishing due to increasing outages, fines related to outages, and so on? The demands, and we saw it from the quote from the UK, are pretty clear. The power grid is regarded as vital infrastructure, and outages are costly for everybody. Our viewpoint is that the cost of doing nothing is far greater than the cost of change. The big question is then, what is it that you need to change and how? In our view, there are a lot of questions you need to dig into, and also a lot of stakeholders you need to think into the equation before you start planning on what to do. What is your ambition for your operation now and in the future? What expectations do you meet from the politicians and from your customers? How will the shift in energy consumption impact your grid? The demands for the power grids are high, and the acceptance of failure are low. So regardless of what your current communication setup looks like, there are pros and cons, and maybe the right approach for you to find your own balance in mixing and matching different technologies to provide you with the capabilities you need. To help you through the process, we have written a comprehensive paper for the utility sector. You can use the paper as a reference guide and a guide to raise all the questions you need to think about when dealing with the challenges you face in terms of connectivity. We suggest you use it as a shortcut, as we have done much of the groundwork for you, so you can spend time on making the right decisions for your operation. Just with your smartphone, you can scan the QR code or type in the link above, and you will get to a page where you can download your copy of our thought leadership paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. I've read the white paper myself, and it's a really well-researched, objective appraisal of the options utilities companies have for improving connectivity, so very much worth a read. So in this next part of the webinar, we're going to look at some case studies from utilities and renewable companies, specific to the challenges Inmarsat and Cobham have highlighted around climate change and threats to cybersecurity and aging infrastructure. These case studies are all from ground control customers, and it is worth noting that they all look at how satellite connectivity can resolve some of these challenges. But I'm going to try and make clear why satellite was the obvious choice in these circumstances. To the previous speaker's point, it's not always, of course, going to be the most appropriate choice. So we're going to begin by looking at a company that maintains a gas pipeline. I can't tell you who they are for security reasons, and I can't go into minute detail about how they operate, but I can give you the gist. For them to be able to run production, a series of pressure and temperature sensors need to provide data to their SCADA system, which then allows gas transmission. And in the event that the sensor data isn't available, not only does production halt, it's also necessary for this company to vent the stacks. And this is a considerable expense to them, and it's disruptive for the communities that live around these terminals. So it's critical that the sensor data is supplied in real time and reliably. And to ensure that the readings are accurate and to maintain connectivity, the company requires that there are two means of moving the data active at any given time. The company has one dedicated fibre connection and two satellite connections, all of which are tasked with this transmission of said sensor data to the SCADA system. Each point-to-point link has two antennas, the hub and the remote. The hub is the larger antenna of the two and receives a stronger signal. And often the remote antenna is positioned with the sensors in a remote area and sends a signal back to the hub, which will be at the base of operations. However, in this case, they have both satellite dishes in very close proximity, but pointing at different satellites. So if one satellite should fail for any reason, they're still sending and receiving data from the second satellite. The companies use this system, importantly, while upgrading the hardware regularly for over 16 years. And in that time, the satellite connectivity has never failed them. And why did they choose satellite? Firstly, because it's clearly highly reliable. And secondly, because it's extremely secure. This particular company's solution has zero reliance on public infrastructure, and it's about as secure a data transmission solution as money can buy. Moving on, this case study looks at how climate change can actually be used for good. RWE is an enormous company, and they operate a series of reservoirs in Snowdonia, North Wales, which is a remote and beautiful part of the UK, which also rains all the time. And that's only increasing with climate change creating more extreme weather conditions. Of course, the ensuing floods are dangerous and damaging for the local environment. And yet, excessive rainfall is an opportunity for RWE to supply more renewable power to the grid. If you can channel that water appropriately, you can replace power generated from coal and gas and divert that water away from roads, paths, and fields. And to turn these potentially negative events into additional green electricity, RWE needs to really closely monitor weather conditions so it can best manage water levels and flow rates. And until 2016, they relied on sending their staff up into the mountains to take measurements, which was time-consuming, costly, and produced limited and often inaccurate results, as well as being potentially unsafe for the engineers. So by installing automated IoT stations to constantly monitor the water levels and weather conditions, RWE would get real-time, accurate data, and they would be able to prevent water wastage and ensure they only sent their colleagues out into the field when they really needed to. However, Snowdonia lacks reliable terrestrial communication links to transmit the data and the connections to the energy grid to power the stations. So the solution was to build 4 satellite IoT-enabled weather stations that measure water levels, precipitation, temperature, etc. And the data is sent back to the power station via Inmarsat satellites. To minimize energy consumption and reduce the size of the solar panels, the data logger uses edge processing to control power to the terminal. By powering up the terminal, waiting for the connection, and then sending data, power consumption is minimized, which also minimizes costs, of course. Data gathered by the IoT station sensors is stored at 15-minute intervals and transmitted every 3 hours. The data logger provides the store and forward capabilities and edge computing for local logic functionality. As well as controlling readings and transmissions, the data logger can also send alarms on exception outside the scheduled transmission timings, for example, and obviously a rapid rise in water level. And all 4 stations have proven themselves to be reliable and stable, and they enable RWE to monitor the local conditions and water levels, which gives them relevant and up-to-date information. And that near real-time visibility over water levels and flow rates has been a game changer. As John's quote says, they've been able to maximize electricity production, reduce water waste, minimize the threat of damage through excessive water, effectively flooding, and keep their staff safe and secure. So pretty much winning on every level there. Finally, and super briefly, we'll look at the Garth Wind Community Wind Farm. This is an unusual project as trustees own the infrastructure, and any profits made from the power generated are ploughed back into community support services. So having real-time data about the power being generated is critical to ensure that Garth Wind know how much energy they can supply to the grid and gain the most economic benefit. And as the Shetland Islands are pretty remote, satellite connectivity is the obvious choice to obtain this data. But it's also worth noting that the trustees expect damage to their infrastructure. They've anticipated it. And they've built into their financial planning the ability to have proactive inspections of the wind farms to minimize the risk of power outages. This means no costly emergency call-out charges and the most important thing, no loss of renewable energy. So I'm going to hand over now to Nigel from Atos, who's going to talk to us about the challenges presented by PSTN's end of life.
Okay, thanks so much, Liz. So hello, everyone. I'm Nigel Garnham from Atos. I work in our energy and utilities consulting practice here in the UK. And here in the UK, the PSTN end of life has become a real challenge for lots of organisations. And I'll be looking at, as well as keeping their operations going, they've also become, in the business of migrating and maintaining operational continuity. So the challenge is that BT here in the UK have decided to withdraw the PSTN in December 25. So that's all the landline services. And it means that that will no longer be a component of services delivered to homes and businesses. So it will only be broadband, which is delivered. So obviously that affects a lot of people who have a landline phone, but it also affects interconnects to other service providers. So for example, if you're using a 2G outstation and that connects back through the PSTN, you will also be affected by the end of PSTN. It also affects businesses who use trunk services or are using voice modem technology at outstations, which has for many years been used as ubiquitous access to operational technology sites. And we'll come on to why that is in a moment. So as Christian says, one of the reasons we're concerned about all this is that one day that bad will happen. And it's not just about PSTN end of life. Bad is also going to happen in the form of 2G and 3G networks being switched off by the early 2030s. So it's not just about the here and now of those copper services. Organizations have got to start thinking about concerns they will have about resilience of core networks as network operators start to prioritize gigabit fiber access for consumers. So CNI voice band data has been in use by many organizations for many years, and many industries with critical infrastructure will be affected. And if we think about replacing voiceband data, think about why it's being used. So legacy features are for dial-up, it's session-based, and it supports very long lines to remote locations, and it's very much voiceband over analog. So it's all the technology we were using to dial up to the internet in the 1990s. But the PSTN means of access is relatively resilient and low cost. So the impact is obviously loss of remote command and control, loss of site security, telemetry, all sorts of aspects of the supply of energy and utility services. And clearly there's going to be a risk to the public and the environment as a result of this. So we can look at alternative technologies that might be available. One that might come to mind is voice over broadband. Now, modems don't perform particularly well in voice over IP technology, but in any case, you would have to put broadband into all of these sites for voice over IP to work. So it's better to take an approach of looking at broadband data, both in the form of copper or fiber access, 4G data, where you've got ubiquitous, potentially all network coverage using roaming solutions, and satellite data, which of course is ubiquitous, but it's got to be right for the location in terms of site aspect and commercial offerings. And at the end of the day, our view is that a range of access technologies will be needed. So here's an end-to-end view of these networks. You've got the remote locations, in this case, the water industry, dialing up over their modems using the PSTN platform, trunk services into the top-end system somewhere, into a SCADA platform and the control center, which is responsible for monitoring and controlling those assets. Now, the existing model is based on regular polling and the ability of remote locations to generate alarms. If we move on to replacement technologies, based on what I've mentioned, you've got fixed and 4G services using both DSL technology, fiber access, a range of 4G, potentially 5G in the future, all sorts of cellular networks if they're available to get the coverage at different sites, and also different sorts of satellite technologies which may be appropriate. So that's why I've kind of drawn an agnostic model here of saying, yes, some sort of satellite technology. I think it's important to say here that it may be a combination of some of these technologies which would be needed to actually maintain a dual path model at particularly critical sites as well. So for example, you might want to blend a 4G and a satellite service together to give a higher level of availability. But also bearing in mind what's happening in the control environment, we think that many organizations will be contemplating a move towards hosted applications. So for utilities organizations, it's really important to make a critical infrastructure transition plan. First thing to do is to get the data capture right, find out the exact locations of all your assets. And that might sound a bit obvious, but many organizations have a very diverse and complex operational estate, and capturing that information for the purposes of desktop planning for communication services is in many cases a non-trivial task. You need to work with multiple communication providers, so don't just go for one for each type of technology, go to several and get as much data as you can from them in terms of the availability of their services at each site. You need to develop solutions based on a range of technologies. So if you've got corporate networks already at site, you might think about using software-defined networks. You might want to use fixed or fiber broadband, cellular, satellite, radio, anything you can lay your hands on to maintain services at these sites. Where you're using IP technology, obviously it's nasty internet protocol, and so it's absolutely critical that you have a cybersecurity plan which is appropriate to the relevant cybersecurity assurance framework for your organization. And obviously machine-to-machine threat analysis and use of encrypted data and authentication is very much part of this. You need to think about it whether if critical sites might need a dual path to maintain resilience and produce a delivery plan. But what you should definitely not do is do nothing and hope the problem will go away, because beyond 2025, the PSTN, if it's still available, will probably be deregulated and unreliable. So some what if scenarios. What if the solutions are agreed, but the deployment is slow? And when you get to site, you think, well, hang on a minute, we've got nowhere to put our satellite antenna. And where's the power supply going to go? And where are we going to put the router? And by the way, the door's just fallen off the roadside cabinet. these are the sorts of challenges you get with having to go to a lot of sites, and you need to build in the capability to be able to deal with these sorts of circumstances as they arise. You also need to make sure that the costs are manageable. So many utility organizations have regulated spending limits, and you need to make sure that the investment settlement covers the amount of work that has to be done. So the takeaway message for today is, will your organization have completed the move away from PSTN before 2025? And what will be the impact if this is not achieved? And this is where Atos can help, because we can provide consulting and design services covering communications, business process, and security compliance. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. And that concludes today's webinar, just on time. Thank you very much to everyone who attended. Really appreciate your time. I hope you found the content valuable. I know there was a lot to take in. Of course, we'll send the link around to the recorded webinar. There's a few Q&As that have come in that I will pick up and send around as part of that email follow-up. And we'll also send around Inmarsat's and Cobham's white papers that they talked about in this particular presentation. You're also very welcome, and I encourage you to email me if you've got any feedback or any questions of our speakers, and I'll be delighted to manage those requests. Thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.